Okay, here we go. Stand by. 3, 2, 1, action.
Assume nothing.
Brash, bald-faced blasphemy.
Question everything.
I find it extremely hard to imagine.
Open your eyes.
It is quite all right to be an atheist.
The fastest growing group of people in the country has been measured as being those who have no belief or who are atheists.
You don't have to be apologetic or quiet about it.
Challenge the opposition.
You see religion on 100 fronts losing the argument.
And start thinking. This is The Thinking Atheist Worldwide.
Today's show brought to you by NatureBox. NatureBox providing a huge variety of online options, over 100 different snacks right there on the website, so you can fill up your online pantry and snack smarter. Delicious stuff like blueberry almond bites, the honey macadamia pretzel pops, the watermelon mini stars, and a whole lot more. And if you haven't tried NatureBox yet, you can get your free trial box right now. Log on to naturebox.com/thinkingatheist. naturebox.com/thinkingatheist. Before we get warmed up here, I was watching this story about a television show that aired last Friday night on the ABC television network called What Would You Do? If you've been following my social media pages, you're probably already aware of what's going on, but I just found it interesting. The show What Would You Do is a show that sets up these sort of hypothetical situations. They put actors among real people. They have the actors do or say specific things, and they watch how the passers-by react. And sometimes it's an interesting experiment, to watch how people will react to something. I saw a great one a couple years ago, I guess. They put like this little girl in a playground in a park somewhere. She was an actor. And they had a guy, this creepy stranger, who was also played by an actor, show up and start to talk to the girl. Hey, little girl, what are you doing? Where are your parents? You want to come with me? That kind of thing. Just to see how the other parents in the playground might react. And it was actually very heartening to see all these people, parents of other children, come in to defend and protect this young girl they did not know. Hey, little girl, where are your parents? Stay with us till we can find them. We'll take care of you. Don't go with this man. We want you to be safe. It was an interesting sort of social experiment, right? And I think shows like that can have merit and be entertaining. I've enjoyed several episodes myself. Well, they did an episode last Friday night, which has, I don't know if it's blown up in their faces or not, but the situation was this. It was a family of 4 in a restaurant, played by actors, mother, father, and 2 kids, probably 9 and 10, maybe, okay? Before the meal, they all join hands and they say the blessing. They pray over the food. Dear Lord, thank you for this food, blah, blah, blah. And another actor sitting in another part of the restaurant, not too far away, a woman who is an atheist, says, hey, would you just stop that? Your prayer makes me uncomfortable. The purpose of the scenario was to see what the other patrons in the restaurant were going to do. Did I mention this took place in Texas? This is a cheap grab for ratings, right? They're trying to get people worked up and pissed off. And of course, that's what the patrons do. They stand up. You just shut up over there. You let this family bless their meal and pray to Jesus. And it's just so wrong-headed. I think Hemant Mehta wrote a blog article about it a couple of days ago. I went on the What Would You Do Facebook page, along with what looks like hundreds of others, just to say this is hugely wrong-headed. Here's essentially what I wrote. I said, I'm an atheist activist. I have never seen an atheist act this way. Not once. This is a surprise to many, but while non-believers have no absence of passion in the God debate, most are also fierce champions for the individual right to believe or not believe in a deity. A family prayer at a restaurant might cause us to sigh quietly, especially when somebody thanks God but ignores the cook and the waitstaff. But we certainly aren't shouting over the tables and attempting to shut down the free expression of individual religious belief. Many of us do take issue with mandatory prayers to a specific deity in taxpayer-funded institutions. The charges that the USA belongs to any specific religion or God and that non-believers should be treated like sub-citizens, we seek proof for religious claims and embrace our own constitutionally protected right to live our own lives without being culturally vilified. But we're not shouting families down in public restaurants when they thank Jesus for the mashed potatoes and the chicken. I frequently enjoy What Would You Do's content, but building this particular straw man in Texas, no less, in no way helps the much-needed discussions on a sensitive issue. Looks like I'm around 1,000 thumbs up, 1,000 likes on that comment, and you're seeing atheists and defenders of free speech from all over chiming in on that. I'll be curious to see if ABC does some sort of a revisit of this topic. I think it's something that deserves fair treatment. Hemant Mehta's blog a couple days ago pointed out the obvious, that, yeah, there'd be people who'd stand up, and religious people who would stand up and defend this family and their right to pray over their own meal. But there would also be atheists who would defend that very same right. This is something that is completely ignored in the story. In fact, I think the subtitle to the broadcast, or the title of the segment, is called, "Could You Turn the Other Cheek?" It just reinforces all these horrible stereotypes. That's right, people. Could you turn the other cheek as Jesus did in the wake of persecution? Meanwhile, all of us atheists, atheist activists, non-activists, whatever, non-believers, looking at each other going, have you ever known anybody who ever did anything like this at a restaurant? I haven't. You know, we might look at each other and go, oh, that's just sad, especially with the two kids sitting there. We think about the indoctrination of the young, blah, 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 but we don't go over there and say, y'all just cut that out. Y'all praying is offensive to me. We don't do that because they have a right to be able to do that. It's just crazy. You know, it reminds me of a restaurant that I did a tour stop in a couple of years ago. I may have told this story. If I have, forgive me. It was in Branson, Missouri. I was doing a presentation, and they rented out this room. It was part of the restaurant. It was like a pizza joint, I think. And I don't know, I think we had 30, 40 people there. And it turns out that nobody in the restaurant wanted to wait on us. No one wanted to wait our tables except for one guy. I think he's the one that told us. Like, nobody else wanted to go and serve the atheist group. I don't know if they thought we were going to taint them with atheism or what. And so this guy came back and single-handedly took care of the entire room. And, of course, we tipped him well. Most interestingly is that while he was back there, he was sort of in on the conversations. You know, he saw the presentation, and I think he even picked up a copy of the book when he left. I always wondered what happened to that guy, you know. Anyway, that's kind of where I've been putting my attention as of late. It's one of those things. It just kind of gets under your skin, you know. Maybe that's what they wanted. They got attention, they got hits, they got page views, they've got controversy. Maybe I've given them exactly what they had hoped for. So, the broadcast tonight, we're talking about science. This is going to be fun. As we talk about selective science, how creationists are often using science, quote-unquote science, to either prove biblical claims, or they're distorting science or ignoring science because it doesn't fit into the Bible. And I've got a panel of experts who are going to talk about this. Each of the three has a lot of experience in this very thing. But first, let me encourage you to go to our sponsor's website sometime tonight, naturebox.com/thinkingatheist. When you see their online store, you're going to find everything sort of partitioned out in all these different sections, different types of snacks for different types of taste buds, the dried fruit snacks, like the fancy fried figs, the Fuji apples, the cherry berry bonanza. They got the fruit and nut bars and clusters. They've got a section of those. The party starters, like the Santa Fe corn sticks. The whole section of just chips and pretzels, if you're a chip and pretzel person. Baked treats, favorites for the kiddos, lunchbox loves, popcorn, snacks. Delicious stuff. You can fill up an online pantry and they ship it right to your door. 0 artificial flavors, colors, or sweeteners, 0 grams trans fats, 0 high fructose corn syrup, and a great way to support this show. It's a convenient, fun, and better for you way to snack. It is Nature Box. You can have your first trial box sent for free right to your door if you want to check them out for the first time. Go to naturebox.com/thinkingatheist. naturebox.com/thinkingatheist. Joshua Rosenau is an evolutionary biologist. He serves as Programs and Policy Director for the National Center for Science Education, an advocate for legitimate science education, and he has written for a number of publications like Scientific American, Science Progress, The Washington Post, and many others. Joshua Rosenau, so glad you could join us.
So glad to be here with you.
Dr. Barbara Forrest is professor of philosophy at Southeastern Louisiana University. She's co-author of the book, Creationism's Trojan Horse, The Wedge of Intelligent Design. She also serves on the board of directors for the NCSE. Dr. Forrest, thank you so much for being on the radio tonight.
Thank you.
Dr. Donald Prothero is a paleontologist, geologist, author, and educator on the faculty at Occidental College for 27 years. Before that, the California Institute of Technology, among others. He has written over 30 books, including a book that totally changed my perception on evolution. It's called Evolution, What the Fossils Say and Why It Matters. Dr. Prothero, thanks for being on the radio this evening.
Thanks for inviting me.
Let's talk first with Dr. Forrest about the Kitzmiller-Dover trial. It was a big case about a decade ago, and you were involved. Can you kind of give us the short story there?
Yes. In 2004, the Dover School Board up in Pennsylvania decided that they would have a policy statement that teachers would have to read to high school students, biology classes, telling them that intelligent design was an alternative to evolution. The teachers refused to read the statement. 11 parents filed suit, recognizing that this was just an attempt to get creationism into their classrooms. I was one of the expert witnesses for the plaintiffs. This was a case that the school board initiated on its own. You can look at it as the result of the Discovery Institute's relentless promotion of intelligent design, but the Discovery Institute did not initiate this policy. In fact, when they learned about it, they tried to get the school board to either rewrite it since it mentioned intelligent design explicitly. And by that time, of course, in 2004, the term intelligent design had already become a liability for the Discovery Institute. Either rewrite the policy or drop it, and the school board refused to do that. So the school board was represented by the Thomas More Law Center. We went to court. The school board had its expert witnesses, which included some people from the Discovery Institute. The plaintiffs had their witnesses, which included me and several other people. And in December 2005, we learned that we had won the case. And not only did we win, we won big. We had presented the science and the facts about intelligent design to the judge, and the plaintiffs, the parents, won that case.
Got a chance to educate some people in the process about what is and isn't science, I'm sure.
We certainly did. In fact, we had 6 weeks. The judge, Judge Jones, let everybody have plenty of time. So the trial lasted for 6 weeks. Everybody had plenty of time to present everything they wanted to present. And of course, that was our golden opportunity to show that intelligent design is nothing except a more recent form of creationism. And the judge recognized that in his ruling. I might add that was the Discovery Institute's golden opportunity to show the world that intelligent design is science. Not only were they not able to do that, but several of their own witnesses bailed out rather than avail themselves of that opportunity. So yes, we did get a chance to literally educate everybody.
Dr. Prothero, I often wonder if intelligent design and creationism is exactly the same thing. Are there differences here?
Yeah, the intelligent design was pretty much cooked up in the late 1990s, about the time they had lost their last Supreme Court case. And it was clearly an effort on their part to remove one more level of the obvious religious roots of the whole thing by trying to pretend they were not a religious motivated group and take away the reference directly to the Judeo-Christian God by just saying, well, the designer could be anyone. It could be a space alien or whatever. And, of course, it was transparent once you looked at the statements of the people behind the ID movement that it was all a sham. It was all a PR thing just to get past the courts and the First Amendment of the Constitution. They were actually clearly trying to motivate themselves by getting the standard Judeo-Christian myth installed and not any other religion or any other point of view. And the irony was that all this was exposed when a famous thing they wrote in the early stages of forming their movement called what we now call the Wedge document came out. And the entire Wedge document was very explicit about how their entire movement is about public relations and political clout, and almost nowhere in there did they actually mention scientific research or doing anything that constitutes something that would really be a challenge in Darwinism. It was all about just winning political battles and PR, not about science. And then, as Barbara mentioned, that movement was very popular in the early part of the 2000s, including President Bush himself endorsing it. But then it pretty much has had to switch tactics ever since the Dover trial.
Let's talk about the Discovery Institute. If one is interested in discovery, you Google discovery or discovering or even science and learning, and perhaps one of the top items in that search engine is the Discovery Institute, which says on its website that they promote, quote, thoughtful analysis and effective action on local, regional, national, and international issues. The Institute is home to an interdisciplinary community of scholars and policy advocates dedicated to the reinvigoration of traditional Western principles and institutions and the worldview from which they issued. Discovery Institute has a special concern for the role that science and technology play in our culture and how they can advance free markets, illuminate public policy, and support the theistic foundations of the West. Well, at first blush, it doesn't seem all that sinister. Joshua Rosenau, you've had some experience with the Discovery Institute?
Yeah, I mean, what I think is interesting about that is even that statement is much more religious than what it would have been even a year ago when it said their About page had their mission statement as a mission to make a positive vision of the future practical. They deliver and promote ideas in the common sense tradition of representative government, the free market, and individual liberty. You know, no reference to religion, very broad scope, but the major work was this work on intelligent design, which they insist is not creationism, is not a religious idea, and they insist that they have all of this research. The Wedge document that Dr. Prothero was mentioning before, in general, doesn't talk much about research, but they claim that as part of their 5-year plan, this was in 1998, so we're well outside when they promised that they would do all of this. There's a great line in it where it says that phase 1, research, writing, and publication, is the essential component of everything that comes after. Without solid scholarship, research, and argument, the project would be just another attempt to indoctrinate instead of persuade. 15 years after that was supposed to have happened, I think we can safely say that solid research and scholarship isn't there. So we have to conclude in their own terms that they are at this point an attempt to indoctrinate instead of persuade. And they've been fairly successful in getting their message out there to the wider world.
Let's talk about the Scopes trial of 1925. Supposedly a referendum at the time on whether or not creationism should be taught or not taught in schools. Can anyone who would like to flesh the Scopes trial out for our audience, what it was, what it did, why it was important?
Sure, I can do it. Scopes trial actually was really not that worried about creationism because creationism was assumed by almost everybody in that time, especially in a state like Tennessee, which was very religious. It was all about suppressing the teaching of evolution. And that's why the Butler Act, which was passed in Tennessee, and there were similar acts passed in some other southern states at the same time, was enacted. It was basically to forbid the teaching of evolution. And then the other sort of thing people don't realize about the Scopes trial, just like other trials, it was deliberately set up as a test case. John Scopes himself was just a gym teacher who really wasn't trained in biology, and they said later he's not even sure he actually did teach evolution. But he was using a book called Hunter Civic Biology, which had it in there, and he was there as a volunteer to put the Butler Act on trial to have it lifted up from local courts to higher courts where it could be declared unconstitutional, presumably on a federal level. And so the whole thing was really, and also, by the way, backed by the city fathers of Tennessee, of, like in the city name, town
Dayton?
of Tennessee. Oh, Dayton, Tennessee. Thank you. Dayton, Tennessee, who were themselves creationists, but they wanted to have the trial to raise money and bring in people to spend money. So it was a very interesting way it came together. And a quick summary of it, it was basically a battle of the most prominent defense lawyer in the country at that time, Clarence Darrow, taking up the case for the ACLU to defend Scopes versus a number of Tennessee lawyers. Their star lawyer was William Jennings Bryan, who at that point had been 3 times the Democratic presidential candidate for the United States presidency, and a very respectable man, but also late in his life, very conservative man who had spent his last career basically fighting Darwinism. And so the trial itself essentially ended up in mistrial very quickly. The judge did not allow Darrow to have any of his witnesses he brought with him to testify that they could be scientists and Christians at the same time. None of them were allowed to testify. And in desperation, Darrow got Bryan to go to the witness stand as an expert on the Bible, and has been in many versions, including Inherit the Wind version. Basically, Darrow destroyed Bryan by forcing him to admit to all sorts of literalism, which in real life, by the way, Bryan was not a literalist, unlike the people who he was working with. And then a couple of weeks, I believe it was, after the trial, Bryan died, but not necessarily directly from the trial, but certainly from his age and his health. And the last twist of irony, of course, is that the judge then committed a legal error where he was not allowed to levy a fine of the size he did on Scopes when the conviction was announced. So then they could not bring the case to higher level courts because it was a mistrial and was not allowed to be appealed and sent to higher courts. So the law remained on the books and stayed on the books until the Supreme Court struck it down with Everson versus Arkansas in 1967.
So here I am reading articles like the ones coming out of Texas, the fights involving the Texas State Board of Education. I see Zach Hoplin's doing a lot of activism in regard to, the very often underhanded tactics of creationists trying to sort of infect the science textbooks of Texans and so many others. The fight continues even today. I mean, the Scopes trial was a long time ago, back in 1925, but we're still fighting these fights, it seems, every day and on every front. Is that an accurate way to look at it?
That is accurate. The United States is plagued by a combination of scientific illiteracy and religious conservatism. And when you put those two things together, you get support for creationism. And so we're still fighting this battle largely because of those two factors. And of course, it has now extended into other areas of science, for example, such as climate science. But the United States, because of those two factors, basically, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but we are still fighting this battle. It's become part of the religious right culture war.
Dr. Forrest, you're in Louisiana, right?
Right.
So I read this story back in 2012, and I've referenced it since, hopefully accurately so, about a small private school in your home state that is teaching the Loch Ness Monster as proof that dinosaurs and humans did and can coexist. Therefore, I guess proving the Adam and Eve Garden of Eden type story. I'm not sure exactly what the angle is. Is this true? And how is this happening?
Now, that story has gotten, it's like the fish story. It's a little bit bigger every time you hear it told. It's not exactly that way.
Okay.
There was a young man in Scotland named Johnny Scaramanga who posted a blog post a few years ago about having been taught in Scotland from, I believe it was in Scotland, from some fundamentalist book that contained something about the Loch Ness Monster. And it turned out that some Christian schools in the United States had used a version of the same book. We never did establish conclusively that they were teaching about the Loch Ness Monster in Louisiana schools. But what is true is that there are Christian fundamentalist schools in Louisiana, as there are throughout the South and probably throughout the country. And they are using materials put out by organizations like Bob Jones University, and they do contain substandard creationist content. Exactly what was taught in Louisiana was really not clearly determined. But that Loch Ness Monster, I mean, that's just such a sexy story. People grabbed it and ran with it. I mean, and it, and that has sort of come to epitomize what's going on in the state. It's not quite that simple.
Let me add something here too, since I wrote a book that includes a whole chapter on the Loch Ness Monster and why it doesn't exist. One of the things we pointed out, Daniel Lux and I pointed out in our book, Abominable Science, all about these cryptozoology myths, is that the largest number of people now pushing cryptozoology, especially when it comes to both the Loch Ness Monster and the so-called dinosaur in the Congo, Mokele Mbembe, are creationist ministers, not actual scientists of any kind, but creationist ministers with no biology training whatsoever. And so you go on to shows like Monster Quest and things like that, where you see these people pretending to be explorers. They're actually creationist ministers with no idea what they're doing, which shows if you know your actual field biology like I do. And so it's very strange because this is why I still don't quite get what they think. But somehow they think if any of these supposed extinct creatures like a dinosaur or a plesiosaur or anything like that were to be found, that all of Darwinism would come crushing down. But of course, we have organisms that lived long, long times and been rediscovered all the time. And that's not an issue at all. It's just their distorted idea of what evolution's about.
Joshua Rosenau, you've seen evidence of people trying to cram theology into scientific discussions and calling it science, or grabbing someone with a PhD beside their name and saying, look, we have a reputable, credible scientist on our side, and he believes in God, and here's why. You've seen a lot of this kind of things on the front lines?
Yeah, once or twice.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, where do these PhDs come from and how credible are they? It sounds impressive on the surface to the layperson watching from the sidelines. Look, this person has a quote-unquote science degree. They are a science expert, and they believe in Yahweh, Jesus, Allah, Thor, whatever. What do we do with that?
One important thing that people should always think about with this is not just, is this a scientist who's saying this thing? Because there are a lot of scientists out there. And sometimes they have really good credentials in their field. I'm blanking on his name. Kurt Wise is one of the leading creation science advocates and researchers in that area. He studied, among others, under Stephen Jay Gould at Harvard for his PhD, right? So it's not that they haven't put in the hours and done the work to do research, but they're coming to it from this place of trying to prove what they already believe to be true, rather than doing what scientists are supposed to do of come to the science and let the evidence guide them and accept when they falsify a hypothesis, accept that that's what happens. And sometimes it's useful. There's something that we have at NCSC called Project Steve, where, because occasionally you'll get this list. The Discovery Institute has a list of 700 scientists who doubt Darwin, PhDs who say that they think that evolution might be wrong. And so we've got a list of 1,300 scientists who say that evolution is right and belongs in schools, and all of them are named Steve or Stephanie or Istvan or Esteban. But just to make the point that this is about 1% of people are named Steve or some cognate of Steve. So you actually can sort of extrapolate it out, but that's not really the point. The point is you can make a lot of lists of scientists who think almost anything. 600 or 800 scientists can sound like a lot, but if you ask how many of them are named Steve, that puts it into a certain perspective. And you can do the same thing with climate change. There are lists of scientists who think that climate change isn't happening or who think that climate change isn't caused by humans. How many of them are named Steve? It's a really easy question to ask as a way to say, oh, okay, so you've got this list of 500 people, but there's a list of 1,300 Steves who think that evolution is good stuff. How does that measure up? Because it's not about what one individual scientist says. It's really about what the body of research says, what the community of scientists working together, trying to disprove each other's work. That's where the rubber meets the road.
Dr. Prothero, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, so when I talk about this topic, and I do it a lot, I point out when you get a PhD, it's not necessarily make you an expert in every field on the planet. And what it actually does is tends to make you a bit more narrow than you might have been when you started, because you're focused on one very narrow area of research, and you have to jump through the usual hoops and do all the usual things to get to that goal. And that does not prove that you're an expert in any field other than the one in which you're trained. And so, you can get a PhD, but you're not an expert in everything else. And that's unfortunately the way the public views it, is somehow some proof that you're a genius in every field. And I say, well, think of it this way. You talked about some of the people who were PhDs or creationists, but none of them had any formal training in fields that are relevant to paleontology or evolution. They were all hydraulic engineers and biochemists, and that was years ago when Dwayne Gish was trained in biochemistry and so on. None of their training had any relevance in it. They would spout about paleontology without having the first idea how to tell one bone from another. And the analogy I said is, well, these guys have PhDs, so you think they're such great experts. Would you trust them to fix your car? Would you trust them to write a symphony? No. Their expertise doesn't extend to that any more than it does to understanding evolution or paleontology.
But you've got people like the molecular biologist Ken Miller. He wrote the book Finding Darwin's God. I've never met the man, never discussed anything with the guy, of course. But I hear that he is a sincere and good guy who's out there defending his faith. And his credentials, at least on paper, look pretty impressive. How does the public, the reading public, the learning public approach the arguments of someone like Ken Miller, who it sounds on the surface like he brings something to the table?
And he does. I mean, he's also the author of the most widely used biology textbook, the book at issue in the Dover trial, which was opposed by some of the creationist board members who complained that it was, quote, laced with Darwinism.
Which he was proud to do.
Yeah, and which I think they probably are now using as in their promotional materials, now laced with Darwinism.
Well, I think my point when I hear about Ken Miller is they don't treat him like they might treat a Stephen Meyer or even a William Lane Craig, for sure. He seems to be a legitimate key player in his field and therefore should be listened to. He allegedly brings more credibility to the table. I don't know if that's accurate or not.
Well, Ken is a good practicing Catholic, and so he has his own religious beliefs, which I know quite a few Christians who are good biologists and evolutionists. And he has his own religious beliefs, but he doesn't yet let them get in the way any of his science. And what has made Ken actually very effective in many decades now is that when he debates a creationist, especially the old-fashioned style, the young Earth creationists, their principal strategy in debating is to make him make their opponent appear to be an atheist, which in their minds is winning the battle right there. And Ken can deflate that immediately because he is a Christian. And so he usually ends up being in a much better position to debate most of the young Earth creationists, and he did this many times against Dwayne Gish and others. So that he stands out as an example of people who don't see a conflict between religion and their faith and science.
Well, if he embraces Catholicism, then is it guided evolution? God sort of spun things in and intervenes occasionally, but it's a natural process of evolution largely. How does he reconcile the two?
I think he would talk about it in terms of God setting natural laws in motion, which ultimately lead to the universe and life as we know it. But it's God, it's a sort of Thomistic God as a sustainer more than as intervening with natural law. And this is something that just last fall, Pope Francis made a comment.
Right.
He was talking about evolution, and he said, God is not, we shouldn't think of God as some magician waving a magic wand, which is very much the young Earth creationist idea of sort of poof, there's a giraffe, poof, there's a lion. And that's not mainstream Catholic theology. It's not mainline Protestant theology for the most part. It's not Jewish theology. And they're even within evangelical circles, which are the most likely to adopt something like that. You've got people like Francis Collins, who's an evangelical Christian and also the director of the National Institutes of Health and former head of the Human Genome Project, who sees no conflict with evolution and his theology. So yeah, there's a wide range of theological responses. And I think what Don said is really important, that it's not in these debates, and debate is the wrong way to try to solve any sort of scientific question. Stage debate is theater. But in these debates, the goal is not so much to try to convince people about the science. It's to try to convince people of what we talk about as we talk about three pillars of creationism or of science denial. The first being attacking the science, because that's what makes it science denial. But the middle pillar is really attacking the moral consequences. So this is something that William Jennings Bryan was doing 90 years ago, saying that the violence of the German military in World War I was a result of the fact that evolution was taught in German schools. That we shouldn't teach it because it has pernicious moral consequences. All of these social evils, including atheism, come from teaching kids that humans are related to animals. And if we want to solve society's problems, we have to stop teaching evolution.
Barbara Forrest, you want to chime in on any of this?
I would like to say something about what Ken Miller does, because Ken's a good friend of mine. One of the things that is notable about Ken is that he makes a clear distinction between what he believes as a Catholic or Christian and what he does as a scientist. And the most important thing to point out is that he never, ever distorts the science to accommodate his religious beliefs. He never does that. And I could say the same thing of a number of other prominent Christian scientists. He never tries to shape the science to suit his religious preferences. He does science in the proper way. He presents it as it is and understands that his commitment as a Christian is a private commitment. And it is his responsibility to make whatever accommodations he must make in light of the way science actually works, which is why he's such an effective spokesman. I think actually Ken is a much more effective spokesman when it comes to science and religion than any people in the non-religious community. And he comes across as sincere because he is.
I'm hearing some shuffling in the background. Just know that the microphones are picking those up, so just be cognizant of it. If you're listening in and you need to mute your mic, go ahead. So, in an effort to convince me that scientists are largely walking away and rejecting evolution because they realize it's scientifically crap and they're embracing creationism, I was given a series of books by Stephen Meyer. Now, Dr. Prothero has written I wish, honestly, I've fantasized about taking an entire show and doing nothing but reading your review first to last word and making that the entire broadcast, because it is almost art. It is so well written, well worded, and just so razor sharp in its criticism of how Stephen Meyer has approached many of these issues. So for those who aren't aware of him, his works like Signature in the Cell and others, Dr. Prothero, can you help me out here? And let's talk about someone that the ID crowd, the intelligent design crowd, places front and center and says, look, here's an quote-unquote expert, and he believes in, I think, young Earth creationism. Can you help me out with this?
I don't think he's young Earther.
He's not?
He accepts the age of the Earth. But
I see.
He's like most Discovery Institute people accept the age of the Earth is old and do not take all of Genesis literally, but they're still very much anti-evolutionists. And so his main approach is the sort of the slicker one than you'll find most of them doing, which is that he tries to appear very reasonable. He tries to sound very scientific, and he tries to then find something that he thinks is a crack in the edifice of evolutionary theory and Darwinism, and then try to exploit it. And so...
Well, let me stop you very quickly.
Sure.
You're saying that he still believes in the Genesis account, Genesis chapter 1 and 2, Adam, Eve, the animals created, all, Noah's Ark, all of that. He just says it happened a long time ago.
You know, I don't even know if he's ever made a statement about Noah's Ark or any of that. I think he's very slick and only talks about evolution in the broadest sense.
Okay.
Which is, I think, true of most of the Discovery Institute people. They will probably distance themselves from young Earth creationists who accept Noah's Ark and other things like, the age of the Earth being less than 6,000 years old. That stuff they try to sometimes distance themselves away from because it does make them look ridiculous. So they try to sound scientifically reasonable, but they also attack evolution in their own way. And I think that's true of Meyer and almost all the people at DI right now. But Meyer's interesting story is he comes across, of course, he has a PhD, but it's in history and philosophy of science, not in any actual scientific field. He's not formally trained in evolution and paleontology or in molecular biology. So he, sort of advertises his PhD, as they all do, is somehow giving him credibility when he has none in fields like that. He's not a paleontologist, not a molecular biologist, yet he feels like he is qualified to write an entire book on molecular biology, which was Signature in the Cell, and then an entire book on paleontology, which was Doubting Darwin. And in both cases, anybody who has a proper training in those fields can read it and in just a few chapters quickly discover how either false it is or misinformed it is or deliberately how it distorts what really is true. And it's all because he thinks he knows enough to understand this field, but of course he comes at it with his own biases to see and cherry pick anything that fits his viewpoint and ignore everything that he doesn't want to see.
It grieves me a little bit, though, if I was a creationist, if I was a believer in the Bible, I was a casual Christian, and I walked by a Christian bookstore shelf, and I saw it, and I read it, and I didn't have the inclination to dig any deeper, which in the faith we were often very much that way, you know. We saw a confirming argument, we nodded, we high-fived each other, and then we went on, you know. It grieves me to think that many people are getting their science from someone who may not be qualified to speak in those fields.
Indeed, and that's a problem. There isn't any filter, any peer review process when it comes to writing trade books or when it comes to doing things on the internet. Anybody's stuff is out there, and you can't tell what's good or bad unless you do the digging that most people don't want to do. And so that's the biggest problem, is that the Discovery Institute made a big effort when Meyer's last book, Doubting Darwin, came out to promote it and to get it on the New York Times bestseller list. And the first week it was out, but that was all because they sold it really heavily to their loyalists to get them to all order it. So it got a big boost, and then it quickly dropped in sales and disappeared after 6 months. But the point being that this is all about publicity. It's not about science. These guys don't actually do science. Nothing in Meyer's work is really up to date with science. In most cases, it's deliberate distortion of science. In my own review of it, which I'll just highlight the main point I made, which he's trying to make the argument in Doubting Darwin that somehow the so-called Cambrian explosion was some kind of inexplicable event that just happened in a geologic instant, and all the multicellular groups of animals you have on the planet today all appeared in almost no time at all. And what he does in there is deliberately distort what evidence we have by ignoring the entire first two stages of the Cambrian, which span over 10 million years. When we get all the different groups of shelled invertebrates, things like trilobites and sponges and so on, in different stages and different steps, exactly as evolution would predict. They don't all appear at once. And his distortion is to completely ignore that crucial piece of evidence, which completely falsifies the entire premise of his book. So it's 700 pages of blather that's all filler, and it completely ignores the one central piece of data that makes this entire premise wrong.
What's so frustrating about that also is that there's really interesting science to be done around the Cambrian explosion, right? There's something interesting was going on there. You've got this stretch of 25 million years when there is a lot of change in the fossil record. 25 million years is not a snap of the finger, right? There's a little bit of a stretch there in time, but there's a lot going on there. And to understand to what extent it's just a matter of how well things could fossilize, was it the rise of predators? Was it changing environmental conditions? There's cool stuff happening there, and there's research that people are doing to try to understand it. But the intelligent design approach is to say, that's when the magic poof happened. And it's like, no, come on. That's where the interesting part is. Don't just wave it away. Investigate it.
Didn't Stephen Jay Gould do a lot on punctuated equilibrium and all that type of stuff in relation to the Cambrian?
Yeah, and the idea of punctuated equilibrium has been horrifically misrepresented by creationists especially, who try to make it something that's opposed to evolution rather than an explanation of how evolution works.
Right. Yeah. Steve was a good friend of mine. I'm a sort of mentor of mine, even though I wasn't his student. And it's basically all about how evolution takes place. It's tempo and mode is the phrases they use. Does it take place in a gradual, sort of slow fashion over millions of years? But what Steve Gould and Niles Eldredge, who was one of my advisors, point out is that if you look at the record from biology, speciation is a process that takes place only in a matter of generations to maybe a century or so, which is too fast to see in the fossil record. So in the fossil record, what you'll get is what appears to be a rapid speciation, but just simply because the fossil record can't see events that are happening in decades or centuries. And then when species are established, then they're stable for long periods of time, which is another interesting problem. None of that denies the reality of evolution, but creationists have tried to do this since the days that first proposed in 1972.
Dr. Forrest, it's interesting how when I was religious, I would have said, oh, you don't trust scientists, right? Don't trust them. They all get together in their little laboratories and they twirl the mustaches and laugh their evil laughs and attempt to kill God, right? It's just a big kegger by evil people to go and destroy all we hold sacred and that kind of thing. So we don't trust science, but the second something scientific comes along that lines up or appears to buttress our religious point of view, we hold it up and we brandish it and we wave it and we shine a spotlight on it and say, look, we have scientific proof. It's a weird sort of a paradox. We don't trust science, but hey, look, here's a piece of science that proves God.
It's a testament to the power of science that creationists have tried to co-opt it, because they recognize that the power of science in enabling people to understand the world. And so they simply have tried to co-opt it. But I think that's, whether they admit that or not, it's their concession to the fact that scientifically they have failed and they're having to cannibalize the science that other people do. One of the things that I'd like to point out about Steve Meyer and people at the Discovery Institute is that these people have never produced one shred of original science to support anything they say. In fact, Stephen Meyer has made an entire career around what his claims about the Cambrian explosion. But I think it's very important for people to know that he's been doing this for 20 years. If you look at the materials that the Discovery Institute is putting out, the most recent of which is a curriculum guide or a discussion guide to accompany Meyer's book, Darwin's Doubt, it's full of stuff about the Cambrian explosion, and there is absolutely nothing new. 20 years ago, when the Discovery Institute first put up a website, I found some curriculum materials that they were planning to make available to people, to students, and they were built around the Cambrian explosion. And so the fact that they are trying to make themselves sound scientific when they have produced absolutely nothing and nothing new, I think it speaks very much to their recognition of the power of science.
Is this what the NCSC does, the National Center for Science Education? Do you just sort of have your radar out for these types of anti-science crusades? And are you involved legally? Exactly what is it you're trying to accomplish? Is it online education? Is it some other kind of activism? What are you guys about?
It's a little of all of that. We don't have lawyers on staff. We have friends who are lawyers. We know people who have law degrees. In the Dover trial, for instance, we served as consultants to the plaintiff's attorneys, and we helped connect some pro bono lawyers who work for one of the bigger law firms in Pennsylvania. There were a couple of lawyers who they worked on reinsurance law, which a reporter asked them, "Is that more exciting than insurance law?" And they said, "No." So they wanted something fun to do where there was clearly a good guy, clearly a bad guy, and they could actually do something for the good guy, not, two insurance companies suing each other over who pays marginally more for some claim, right? So they were having a blast and they were happy to help out. So we didn't supply the lawyers, but we helped connect the lawyers. We helped round up people who served as expert witnesses, including Barbara, some of whom are or were at the time board members of NCSC. And we do a lot to try to beat the bushes and find these sorts of incidents that are happening as they're happening and give people the resources that they need. But it's all, a lot of that work is local. And if we do it right, it doesn't go to court. Court cases are horrific. And in a place like Dover, they needed a judge to come in and say, you guys are right and you guys are wrong and y'all need to stop fighting. But usually it's one parent who feels very, very lonely. And as much as anything, what we're doing is just being a shoulder for them, and to say, you're doing the right thing, and it's the right thing for your children and all the other kids in that classroom. And in the end, they're going to thank you, and helping protect them from any backlash. There was a case in Ohio where a teacher literally burned a cross into a child's arm with a high voltage device. And it took months before the parents filed a lawsuit against the district when it was revealed that there was also creationism being taught and all sorts of stuff. They filed an anonymous lawsuit, but when the parents' names were leaked, they had to leave the town because the father was an insurance salesman and no one would buy from him anymore. It can be really hard for people to come forward. It's hard to hear about those cases and to find those people who are willing to speak out when it comes up, and we do what we can to protect them and encourage them and support them through that.
One of my favorite articles on the National Center for Science Education website it was written 30-some years ago by Robert Moore, The Impossible Voyage of Noah's Ark, an amazing dissection of the tale of Noah, and the floating zoo and camels and penguins coexisting on a boat we can go on and on. Of course, this is old hat to all of you, but to see exactly how he tackled this sacred story, the building of the structure and the animals themselves and surviving the flood and feeding them and all of these. He literally takes a beautifully dissected scientific look at the story and just dismantles. It's just almost complete. When he's done, I just think, what else is there? And I'll try to remember to include the link to that article in the description box of the show. But you guys have a lot of articles along those lines, right? We take something that has been assumed and we're going to treat it scientifically. Dr. Forrest?
Oh, I would encourage everybody to go to ncse.com and just look around at just to explore the website. We have it very nicely set up, and we have our materials clearly divided between, the stuff on creationism and evolution, the stuff on climate science. So I think, the best advice is for people just to go take some time and look around to see what's there.
I'll present the question. Any one of you can jump in. They say that science answers the question of what, but science cannot answer the question of why. And I personally consider the question itself to be flawed, but I hear it so often I'd like one or perhaps even all of you to address it, right? Science can tell us about the nuts and bolts, but the reasons, why we are here, science can't touch them. These are either philosophical or theological questions. Anyone want to speak to that?
Oh, I'll jump in quickly.
Mm-hmm.
It depends on what you mean by why. Science can answer the question of, for example, why a giraffe has a long neck, explain how those processes happen, why they happen. Sometimes the how and the why are the same question. But what science cannot do is to answer, to give what people think of as ultimate answers, final definitive answers, like why something exists. And to tell the truth, there really is no such thing as an ultimate answer that answers the question of why definitively. The only thing you could, think of as an ultimate answer to the question why is an answer that raises no further questions. And there is no such answer. So I think you're right. I think the question is flawed.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, lots of times people say, well, what's the meaning of this and why are we here? And those are great things to think about. But lots of times I think the problem is that the question's wrong to begin with, that maybe you're putting a frame on the universe that really doesn't belong with it. And that comes a lot with our anthropocentric view of the world, that we have to view things with our own filters and in terms of why humans are more important than everything else. But as someone who sees all of life in its broader perspective, those kinds of questions tend to diminish. And I say, well, maybe the question doesn't have any meaning in the first place.
I don't know that it's the wrong question, but it's certainly not a scientific question, and that's okay. It's okay to say, I like the works of Charles Dickens and you don't, and I don't know why. Right? I don't have an aesthetometer that lets me, I can point at a painting and say, this is why this is more attractive than that one. I can look at the neurology and the neurobiology and the evolutionary biology that might explain why I might find some things more attractive than others, but it's okay to say that aesthetics or your preference for one sports team over another, that doesn't have to be explained scientifically. That doesn't mean that it's a bad question. It's not necessarily a question that should come up in a science class. And a lot of times the conflicts that happen are because people don't feel like they know where to have these conversations. So they try to force them into a science class where they just don't belong.
I heard I don't even know if this is accurate. I just love the analogy that someone who is trying to discover counterfeit money, right? Let's say they're a law enforcement official and they're trying to find a fake. They don't spend all their time studying the different types of fakes. They become intimately familiar with the real so that whenever a fake comes along, they can sort of see the difference. I don't know if that has merit or not, but on its surface, I kind of like the idea. If we're genuinely involving ourselves in a scientific method and we're surrounding ourselves with good science, when science that is not backed up, when it's pseudoscience, when it's theology, not science, rears its head, we can sort of see it coming. Is there any merit to that? Anybody want to speak to that?
Sure. That's something I'm very much clear, and especially if you're a member of the scientific community as I am, that you get to know how scientists work and what science is about. It's about peer review. It's about pushing ideas out there, and often the ideas turn out to be wrong, and that's how science advances, by getting rid of bad ideas and moving forward. And you can very quickly have like a smell test where you can tell where someone has done the proper work behind it and has backed their research with appropriate amount of analysis and data and so on. And then if it's past peer review the first time, you still have to look at it skeptically before it's final. And there, the whole methodology of science is very well set up to sniff out what's bad ideas from good ideas. And it doesn't matter who you are. It's the idea itself and how it can pass muster in this very rigorous gauntlet of the scientific community that counts. So it doesn't matter if you're a genius or just unknown. It's the quality idea itself that should be the reason that it wins or doesn't win. And ultimately, most ideas we have turn out to be wrong anyway, and we just keep changing them. And that's okay. That's the way science always operates.
Well, that's not okay, according to many creationists. They say science is always having to change its mind. Why would you hang your hat on science?
That's exactly right, because that is a very different mindset from what is typical in the creationist community, which likes simple, final answers that never change. And to be a scientist, and a good scientist especially, you have to be comfortable with uncertainty. You have to be comfortable with the fact that all these answers are tentative, they're provisional, and they probably never see final truth. A lot of philosophers of science say there's no such thing as final truth in the scientific context, the way most people use the word. And most scientists are comfortable with that. They love the fact that there's always new frontiers to move forward. And we're very much against this conspiracy of science idea that you might hear there from the creationists or the climate deniers, that we somehow all get together. No, we love to tear each other apart. We love to shoot down anyone else's ideas, and we never accept anything on anyone else's say-so. There's no dogma allowed. You have to be able to test your idea and substantiate it, and then it goes through testing over and over and over again before the majority of the scientific community accepts it. And that's what evolution has done. That's what climate science has done. That's what gravity has done. These are all theories which are now extremely well accepted in the scientific community.
When you mention peer review, and I've heard this one as well, and like anyone on the panel to address it, how pure, for lack of a better way of saying it, how pure is the peer review process, and how much of it is just politics? I mean, how does it work? What does it do? And why can we almost always rely on the process?
There's a lot that could be better about it, for sure. And those of us who've written papers and published them all have horror stories about cases where there was something that was clearly political, that clearly the reviewer knew who we were and decided that they didn't like us. But peer review doesn't stop at the time that a paper is published. And
Right.
so this is something that just came out in late last year. There was a study where it's published in Science, major paper, dramatic findings that found that when canvassers went door to door in Los Angeles talking about same-sex marriage, that there were persistent effects. 6 months later, if you re-interviewed those people, a 20-minute conversation with a gay person made people more accepting of same-sex marriage 6 months later. That contact was a critical part of changing people's minds. A huge finding with lots of implications. A grad student at another university was following up on this, trying to replicate it, and couldn't, and started asking questions and asking more questions and not being satisfied with the answers. And that paper was withdrawn and retracted from the journal last week or the week before, because it turned out that the data may never have been collected that it was based on. The funding sources that were cited didn't actually pay for it. There were all these problems, and a grad student dug it up, which is how peer review works. It's not that it stops when the paper is published. People then try to replicate it. They try to find other ways to use that, and if it doesn't prove out, then it gets shot down. But the peer review process probably should have done more to catch that before publication also. So there are problems, and we try to fix them. But science, since the time of Francis Bacon and his Idols of the Mind, has been really about that process of figuring out how can things go wrong, and how do we fix all the ways that humans, by our nature, try to fool ourselves and fool other people. How do we stop that? That's really what science is.
Yeah, I could add to that. I mean, scientists are humans, right? We all have our biases. We all, like to think certain things and not other things. The late Richard Feynman said, you're the easiest person to fool. Scientists, and especially, can be in love with their ideas. And the whole idea is that one individual can't, by themselves, do the whole process. It's the entire community looking at the ideas, scrutinizing them, testing them rigorously over and over and over again, that finally winnows out the what Carl Sagan called the deep truth from the deep nonsense. And to emphasize Josh's point here, when a paper appears in Science, I still tend to be skeptical of it, because there's a lot of pressure to make big headlines and to make the media pay attention in these days, which weren't true even in my generation that started science. And a lot of these ideas that come out in scientific journals, of course, turn out not to be true when they're replicated. And so anyone who's in a community for the long haul, like I am, what you find you're doing is you see a paper in Science, you make a note of it, you sort of file it in the back of your brain, and then a couple of years later, you usually end up noticing if it's been debunked. If it's in a field where I actually work in, then I often actually jump in and dig into it and look into the information. And then sometimes in my own case, I've actually done it myself. I'll go and try to test it myself and see if it actually holds up. And before I get around to saying putting it in one of my textbooks I've written, one of the things I always do is I wait until it's been several years since that paper's been published, because if the idea holds up, and especially if it's an important one, lots of people will try to test it after publication. And then it may turn out to be completely debunked and then 2 years after it published, which is fine. That's the way science works. And then I don't put it in the textbook unless it survived that long gauntlet. And that's something we always have to keep in mind here. It's not just about one publication. It's about a multi-year vetting process that eventually winnows out the bad ideas. And the ones that have survived that are the ones we end up in textbooks and end up taking it seriously.
It's not like a meat grinder, man. It's like you enter the fray, and if you survive at the other end,
it's very tough on your ego. I mean, this is the review process is usually anonymous, so you get people saying very nasty things about you, and unless you can figure out what they wrote, who they are, you can't tell. It's similar in the writing of grant proposals and having grant proposals reviewed. These people can be very nasty and often completely miss the point of what you're writing about or what you're trying to do, and you have no recourse to fix it. You just have to keep on trying. It's very tough.
Dr. Forrest, anything to add? Are you good?
Well, I think what is striking about what Josh and Dr. Prothero are saying is that the very process of science that produces articles that sometimes cannot be with data that can't be replicated, the same process is the source of the correction. It's like Josh said, peer review is ongoing. And so even though the peer review process is not perfect, I think it's probably the best thing that there is. Because if there is anything to an idea, or if there isn't, someone else is going to either confirm it or disconfirm it. In other words, science, that's part of the self-correcting process of science, that research is ongoing. So science is not perfect. The scientific method is not perfect, but the thing that keeps it going is that it is self-correcting and self-sustaining.
So the guy who says he's invented cold fusion, he has the claim. And there might be a few scientists that say, hey, this has promise or whatnot. And then immediately we realize science and scientists have examined and said it's a bunch of crap. The correct process was taking place. Science was keeping itself in check.
That's right. The cold fusion story is a classic case of that, actually, because the two scientists who did it were pretty much under pressure to produce results, and they were sort of fooling themselves in the process of doing it. But what's really striking about the cold fusion case, and more than probably any other recent case in the history of science, is it was such a startling idea and had such potential, if it were true, that we could actually have cold fusion, which would indeed be a very powerful solution to our energy issues, that immediately hundreds of scientists around the world jumped in and dropped what they were doing and started to replicate this, which is normally not the case. Normally, if a couple of people pay attention and want to test your data, that's surprising. But to have dozens to hundreds around the world doing it, which is why almost within days after it appeared in the media, it was already being questioned. And within a couple of weeks, enough people had shown that it was, in fact, not what they'd said it was.
Let's talk about climate science. It's come up many times in this broadcast already. A congressman, senator from my own home state of Oklahoma, recently stood on the floor of the House with a snowball. And he brought it in and he held it up in front of everyone because it had been that cold and we'd had that much winter precip in that certain month of the year. And this is proof that we're cooling down. We're not warming up, And of course, I think he even threw the snowball down and I don't know the whole story. I just know that this is indicative of how many people argue against climate science. And I want to get into climate science. Is there real climate change happening? How do we know? And what do we do about it?
Yes, there is real climate change happening, and it's definitely caused by humans. That's the short answer to what you just asked. And the reason we know this is because we have a tremendous amount of data from community all over the world. It's not just American scientists, but scientists from every country in the world that contributes to climate, basically from every possible source of data we could have, from the melting of glaciers to the changes in sea level to the atmospheric changes being measured in multiple ways, to satellites which watch the heat we produce and the CO2 we produce and pinpoint its source. We have the geochemistry of the carbon dioxide itself, which is increasing the atmosphere. It has the fingerprint of being burned by fossil fuels, which tells us it's not a natural source. We have the way in which, for example, the stratosphere, which would be should be cooling if or warming if this thing comes in the sun, and this troposphere, the layer we breathe, would be cooling. In fact, the troposphere is warming. The layer we're in is warming because we're producing heat at the Earth's surface, and the stratosphere is cooling. That was considered like the final sort of nail in the coffin, the proof that it was in fact human caused. We see it in lots and lots of other kinds of things. We can track it in the way the various measurements are made at all sorts of stations around the world. The glaciers melting on both poles and on all the mountains of the world. All the signals virtually universally are giving us the same answer. And that's why we not only know it's real, but with almost all those things, such as the evidence is fossil fuel, completely show that it's human. And the final clincher is that we can rule out any natural climate cycle, which is something you often hear the climate deniers talk about. They, the planet's been warm in the past. Well, climate science knows how the planet's been warm in the past, and we know its causes. And we can rule out, the most conclusive way we can rule out that's anything but humans that did it, is we can look at a famous ice core that was drilled in Antarctica about 10 years ago, the Epica 1 ice core, which has almost 700,000 years of continuous record of the atmosphere in this long, long ice core. And they take little bubbles of atmosphere. They're trapped in the ice core as old as 680,000 years ago, some of them, and can measure the carbon dioxide for the entire last 680,000 years of the planet's history. And at no time during all the warmest periods of interglacials that we've had 6 of them in that interval time, was the atmospheric composition any higher than 280 parts per million carbon dioxide. And today it's well over 400. And it's shot up entirely due to human activity. And so that's a wealth of data. And that's why 97, 98% of climate scientists are convinced that it's real and that humans did it.
I just want to follow up on, Dr. Prothero did a beautiful job of summarizing the science that establishes that yes, the climate is changing, it's warming, and humans have contributed to this. I think what's really important for your audience to know is that the doubt about climate change is a manufactured doubt.
Right.
I'm reading right now, I finally got around to picking up Merchants of Doubt. It's a book by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway. And chapter 1 is an eye-opening chapter because what Oreskes and Conway showed is that the doubt about climate science, the way this doubt is manufactured, it was manufactured as a product to be sold by the people who, for various political and economic reasons, do not want to acknowledge that the climate is changing. But these people, the climate deniers and even the Discovery Institute, they are following a pattern of the process of manufacturing doubt, which was literally patented by the tobacco companies.
Yep.
So I think that is an extremely important thing for people to understand. Not only is the science fully supportive of the fact that the climate is warming, but that there is a great deal now of documentation showing that the doubt about climate change was manufactured just as the doubts about the dangers of smoking were manufactured. And having read this chapter, I've noticed that the Discovery Institute has followed this strategy completely, right down to the compiling lists of scientists who dissent from Darwinism. The tobacco companies compiled a list of dissenting doctors. So when the climate deniers talk about doubts about the science, they are simply following a strategy which was created and marketed by the tobacco industry. That's fascinating, I think.
So we're not just talking about the opinions of someone who holds to the dominionist view that God created them to be given dominion over the earth. We're talking about the multi-billion-dollar pockets of special interests who want to continue doing what they do. And so they sort of cook the books on climate change.
Oh, I think with climate change, that's exactly what's happening. Now, the Christian dominionists have jumped on this wagon for their own reasons, but because the idea that, I think there was a gentleman in Congress by the name of Shimkus who said that, he didn't believe in climate change because God promised that after the flood, Noah's flood, he would never destroy the earth. Well, there are people who hold that view, but when it comes to climate change, they are not the dominant factor in the process of sowing doubt. It's more a political and economic problem than it is a religious problem when it comes to climate science. Although there are people, Catherine Hayhoe is a climate scientist who's trying to address this in the evangelical community. But we're dealing with a more complicated problem when you talk about climate denial. It's not just as simple as pointing to the religious community and saying, this violates their religious beliefs, so they deny that the climate is changing. It's quite a bit more complicated than that.
In Merchants of Doubt, which is a great book, and one of these days I will see the movie, which I've heard amazing things about also, they talk about the climate change denial coming from what they refer to as free market fundamentalists.
Right.
So it's the same sort of fundamentalism. It's just applied to a different subject. It's the same mindset, but originating in a different place. And the interesting thing there are some evangelical Christians. Catherine Hayhoe, when she talks about this, she'll often say, when she's talking to evangelical audiences, she'll just say, well, we know that the earth is warmer than it's been in thousands of years. She doesn't have to say in hundreds of thousands of years, even though that's also true. It's just not a fight that she needs to pick right there. And there's sort of two strains in theology. There's the dominionist strain that you've talked about, and there's also what you sometimes see talked about as a stewardship strain, what some evangelicals especially talk about as creation care. And that's taking that same literal reading of Genesis and saying, because we were given dominion and told to take care of the earth, if we're going to take that literally, it means that we have to be concerned about climate change. And we have to do something serious about it because that's part of the mandate that we were given. It's not just to dominate. It's not just to name the animals. It's to protect them. And that's really interesting, that there are people who, because of their creationist beliefs, feel obliged to take climate change very seriously as a matter of policy and of action on their own parts.
And getting back to what Barbara was just saying there, if you read Rescues and Conway, very nicely documented. I mean, the smoking guns are all documented. Memos leaked from meetings between the petroleum institutes and the various oil companies and the various right-wing politicians who they pay to do their bidding. It's all, the tracks are all there. It was all basically very clearly set up as a vast right-wing conspiracy, if you want to use Hillary Clinton's words. But it clearly had nothing to do with science. And had nothing to do with anything other than just the oil companies, the Koch brothers, the various libertarian institutes deciding climate change is something they wanted to stop in the public sphere. And all about PR, because they don't actually do scientific research against climate change. They just do things that are all about public relations and about political power.
But be encouraged, minds can be changed. When I freshly emerged from religion, I was a climate change skeptic is what I called myself. I've got some questions, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I bought a lot of that. It's arrogant of humankind to think we could ever affect the ecology, blah, blah, blah. And it was actually an article I think you, Dr. Prothero, were involved in Skeptic Magazine. It was like a whole issue that there was nothing but climate science. And it's not a light read, but by the time I was finished with it, I found myself thinking, I've got to totally reconsider my position. This is overwhelmingly documented stuff. It's very impressive.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that's the whole idea. The hard part, as you say, is having an open mind to read it in the first place. And sadly, so many people what they've shown is it doesn't have anything to do with people personally having any doubts about climate science as something that affects their worldview like evolution does. It's more that because climate science is now hitched to the same right-wing thinking that comes from creationism and comes from so many other things like hardcore capitalist thinking, and then, of course, pushed all by the giant Fox news bubble, as they call it, it's part of your identity as a right-winger to agree with the climate deniers. What's ironic is that that's not actually the numbers show that the rank-and-file Republicans, for example, the polls show not actually that big on climate denial. It's only their leadership that is. But their leadership, of course, has tremendous funding from the energy companies that's paid their bills. So they have a vested interest in trying to force the rest of the rank-and-file to agree with them. And at the moment, of course, they hold Congress. And just to go back to the point you started out with, it was James Inhofe on the floor of the Senate who did that, threw the snowball. And the thing about it that's so laughable is that, of course, Inhofe represents what's so typical, unfortunately, of so many Americans who don't understand the first thing about science. That is that weather is not climate. Okay, weather is what happens on a short-term basis, fluctuations on a scale of hours to days to weeks at the most. Climate is an average of weather over usually hundreds to thousands of years is more typical. And we don't, they're not the same thing in any real sense, other than that when climate changes, it will cause certain weather events to be more common, such as heat waves and more monstrous hurricanes and so on, in which case climate change affects weather. And what Inhofe is doing is playing to this broad spectrum of people who don't know the difference. And then he throws a snowball. Everyone says, oh, well, that just proves climate change. No, it just shows that he had unusual weather in the Northeast during the time that event happened. And the irony is, of course, climate scientists can explain why he had such a cold northeastern United States. It's actually related to climate change and the planet getting warmer. And what it's related to, actually, is because what's happening is the North polar ice now is so thin in the summertime it vanishes, almost half of it vanishes every summer. That has changed how much of a thermal gradient there is between the poles and the more temperate latitudes, which has weakened the jet stream that normally separates the two, so that when you get a very weak jet stream, that means that cold polar air mass can slide down to latitudes like Washington, D.C. in the Northeast and sit there for a while and give you record cold. But if you look at the actual temperature data for that period of time when D.C. was warm or cold, and also was New York and all the rest, the entire rest of the planet was warmer than average. And that's what we got to remember. 1 degree doesn't sound like much, but that's an average over a whole globe. 1 degree is a lot. And to give you a sense of how much it is, it's only a couple of degrees it took for the whole planet to go from a glacial state to an interglacial state. That's how much difference that makes.
It must be said, Senator Inhofe said, I was quoting an article in New Republic I saw where he had said this, quote, "My God, still up there, the arrogance of people to think that we human beings would be able to change what he, capital H, he is doing in the climate, to me is outrageous." So he's obviously starting with the Bible first and doing his science much, 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 much later.
Look at his earlier writings. It's all about the people who pay his bills. And you just look online, who his biggest funders? It's all energy companies.
Have any of you seen the documentary Chasing Ice?
Yes, I have. It's excellent.
Over the course of a very short period of time, they sort of showed the immense amount of calving of the glaciers and how much ice has been lost proportionally in relation to, the hundreds of years in the past. And it just gave you the chills, literally, to see this kind of thing happening in such a short period of time. I almost considered it to be like, required viewing for anybody who's curious about the climate change argument.
I agree. It's so powerful because, people respond to different kinds of things. You can argue and argue and argue with people, but it doesn't always sink in. But just to sit there and watch the entire Greenland ice sheet disappearing as you watch it in that movie, and they don't preach at all. They just let you see the data, basically. And that's what all the rest of the climate science community knows about. But we have such a hard time communicating this over this giant buzz of PR from the climate deniers.
As we wrap up the show, I'll start with you, Josh Rosenau. What's the best way to inoculate ourselves against bad science?
I think it's really important, first of all, just to acknowledge that science denial is something that it doesn't come from someone's attitudes about science necessarily. It comes from these deeply held issues of personal identity, personal values, and all of us in various ways do this. All of us take positions on things that we have not had time to study in any great depth, but because we know people like us think a particular way, that's the stance that we take. And it's not an unreasonable thing to do, but it is unreasonable to let that overwhelm the evidence as the evidence accumulates. So I think for ourselves, it's just being honest with ourselves and listening to that diversity of voices and evaluating the evidence on its own basis and separating claims about science from claims that are outside of science.
Dr. Forrest?
I think to some extent that we are going to have to just outgrow this. There is no magic pill that we can give people that will make them accept science when it threatens their personal value systems. But I think over time, as we keep chipping away at the problem, as we keep addressing it, putting the good science out where people can see it, trying to explain it to them. That's the one thing we can't stop doing, is to trying to present the science to people in a way that they can understand, in a way that's not threatening to them. So I think you simply have to keep doing that and just understand that this is going to be a long process. The United States is still a young country, and there are some things that we simply have to outgrow. But along the way, we have to find a way to present the evidence in a way that does not insult people, that does not threaten them, that does not downplay the concerns they have about the things that make their lives meaningful. And the one thing that we do have to do, though, is go after the people who exploit the lack of understanding of good, decent people with their own agendas, like the Discovery Institute does. Those are the people that we have to go after and pointedly, explain what they're doing. But with the average rank and file person, I think we have to be straightforward, but gentle and respectful, and just realize that this is a process that's going to take a lot of time.
Dr. Prothero?
Yes, I would agree with those previous points. It's It seems frustrating. I've been battling creationism for more than 35 years of my life, and I've never seemed to get anywhere. But it's actually improving, and the same is true of climate science as well. I mean, nearly all other developed countries in the world, that's all of Northern Europe, certainly, and much of developed Asia and so on, long ago accepted evolution, climate science, and all this stuff is not controversial in those countries. We're virtually the last place in the world that's developed that's still having trouble with this. And it's gradually going to just become less and less of an issue. I think climate science is not going to take very much longer before the deniers are just simply ignored, because the poll numbers are showing over and over again that bit by bit Americans are coming to realize that climate change is real and we have to do something about it. And some of them show that up as 80% of Americans agree with this. And that's something that's encouraging. It shows that even though the deniers are trying real hard to dominate the message, they're not holding back the tide. And the irony is, of course, it's not the arguments of scientists or anybody talking on PR or anything like that. It's actually weather events, which technically speaking are not climate, but weather events that get people to change their minds. The best example being right before the 2012 election, when Hurricane Sandy came striking, and of course delayed all the election process for about a week and all the rest, and took the election off the headlines. And the polls right after Hurricane Sandy had a giant response, a jump in the number of people who accepted that climate was changing. Nature itself had to knock on our door to let us know that we're in trouble. Evolution is going to take longer in this country. It's going to take changing a lot of viewpoints. But I look at the new numbers about how how the younger generation now accepts a lot of things that the older fundamentalists did not, especially things like climate science and evolution and a lot of other ideas like gay marriage and so on. All those ideas seem to be packaged together with the younger millennials. And another 2 or 3 election cycles, they will be the strongest voice in the country. And I think the battle over creationism will start to recede.
Donald Prothero, Barbara Forrest, Josh Rosenau, thank you so much for being wonderful educators and for being storytellers of science. I think those of us who are not scientists but are fascinated need people like you who can help to sort of couch it in a way that really science is exciting when it's done right. The science of evolution I find to be just an amazing, fascinating, even beautiful thing. It's an awesome period to be alive when we can really begin to understand these things, and you have been a vital part of those conversations. So thank you for that, and thank you for being a part of the broadcast today. It means a lot.
Thank you. We need people like you to help get the word out. Thank you, too.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, thanks for having us on.
Thanks so much for listening tonight. Now that the broadcast is over, make sure and check out our show sponsor's website, naturebox.com/thinkingatheist, with over 100 delicious and healthy snack options just for you. You can fill up your online pantry and have those snacks delivered right to your door. And a free trial awaits those who have never tried NatureBox before. Log on to naturebox.com/thinkingatheist. naturebox.com/thinkingatheist. And I'll see you next week.
Follow The Thinking Atheist on Facebook and Twitter. Watch dozens of original videos on the Thinking Atheist YouTube channel. And visit our website for resources, links, contact information, the editor's blog, and more. thethinkingatheist.com.